Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. Today we're talking fighting games. These are video games of the martial arts or hand-to-hand combat category. They come in a variety of flavors. I'm not going to number them or list them all. I'm just going to talk about the ones I'm aware of or have experience with. The most common fighting game is your 2D one-on-one single location, single screen fighting game. Some examples would be the Street Fighter series, the Mortal Kombat series, Art of Fighting, King of Fighters, World Heroes, Samurai Showdown, plenty of others. These are pretty, they're pretty simple games on their surface. They can be deep or complex games, but they don't have to be. And most of them aren't. Most of them are pretty basic, pretty simple. They usually have a, we'll just say flimsy story that doesn't always make sense. There's usually some sort of contest or tournament or some such that the characters are engaged in with varying degrees of stakes. Whether it's like they have to win the tournament to save the world, or win the tournament to get the clout, or win the tournament to get the money to, I don't know, pay off the mafia or whatever the fuck it is. Like I said, the story's not important. They're usually pretty fucking flimsy. These are your standard fighting games. When people say fighting game, this is what they're talking about most of the time. Now, you also have the polygonal 3D rendered fighting game as well, which is basically an extension or evolution of the 2D fighting game. It's the same core concept, two people in an arena beating each other up until one person's knocked unconscious, or in some cases, killed, depending on the game. Most notably, Mortal Kombat. I don't know what to do about this flopping. They don't necessarily have to be in a 3D space. Usually they are, but sometimes they can be on a 2D plane, but done with 3D graphics. Some examples would be Street Fighter 4, Mortal Kombat 2011, I think it is. Even Mortal Kombat X, really. There are a few examples like this, but a lot of them, your Tekkens, your Virtua Fighters, games like that, Soul Calibur, they have a 3D arena that you can walk around in. Sometimes you can have an arena out where if you knock them out of bounds, you win automatically, but that's not always the case. And again, like 2D fighting games, they may or may not have finishers. You know, again, in the case of Mortal Kombat 4, Deadly Alliance, Deception, those are 3D arena fighting games in the Mortal Kombat family. Well, Mortal Kombat 4 is pseudo 3D. 3D rendered, it's on a 2.5D plane. It's a 3D plane, but you're on a 2D plane that you can rotate. But you stay on a 2D plane, you can just rotate around different planes. It's complicated. But Deadly Alliance and Deception exist in a fully 3D plane. So there is that. Deadly Alliance is probably my favorite of all the Mortal Kombats for a lot of reasons. Of course, my second favorite is Mortal Kombat 2, and then the original, and then Trilogy is up there. So those are your standard 2D, 3D fighting games. Now, for the most part, they have core concepts that are very similar. They have special moves, you got punches and kicks, or some sort of martial arts type move, jump kicks, back flips, etc., sweeping kicks, roundhouse kicks, things like that, uppercuts. And then occasionally you have special moves that involve like magic or supernatural elements or sci-fi elements in some cases. You know, shooting laser beams or throwing fireballs or summoning the wind or shooting lightning out of your fingertips, etc. But occasionally you have weapons-based combat as well. Swords, guns, knives, things like that. Some fighting games, like Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, mix it up. You get the hand-to-hand combat, or the supernatural combat, or weapons combat, depending on how you want to play. You also have moves that are known as combos. Different fighting games handle combos differently. Some have predetermined combos that you push the buttons or perform moves in a specific pattern, and it just chains your moves together in what we refer to as a combo. Others have what are known as auto combos. You just push a button, a certain button or sequence of buttons, and your character just does combos automatically. Your Marvel vs. Capcom and Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Mortal Kombat 3, and I think there's a Street Fighter game that's like this, but don't quote me on this. And then you have some games, again, like Street Fighter and King of Fighters that are in between. They're pseudo-chained, pseudo-auto, in that there are certain moves that can trigger a combo sequence, and then from there, it's up to you to, like, hit the right buttons. But if you do it right, you can get in what's known as an endless combo. But some games also have a combo breaker, which can get the person being beaten up out of the combo. Not every game has a combo breaker. You also have in addition to your standard attack moves, you have a handful of defensive moves or support moves. Several fighting games have a block function. Sometimes it's a button you press and then your characters just block, which reduces the damage and makes some moves ineffective or null and void, depending on the game and or the moves. Other games like Street Fighter, you have to push away on the joystick from your opponent, and your character will do a block. Now, I mentioned block as a type of defense. You also you can jump backwards or walk away from opponents. You can also do, like, roundhouse kicks and things like that to distance yourself from your opponent. These are offensive moves that are used in a defensive way. And then you have support moves. Mortal Kombat 3/Trilogy introduced the run button. Several fighting games have what's known as a taunt button, which has different effects depending on the game. Sometimes it can stun your opponent. Sometimes it can drain a little bit of your opponent's life or their special, whatever their special is. And sometimes it gives you bonus energy. So these are your core fighting game mechanics. You climb a ladder, you beat the opponents in order, in sequence, you get to the final boss, you beat the final boss, you get the end credits, and sometimes a story clip or a cutscene or something, and then you're done for the day. Fighting games were born out of arcades, so they do tend to have the arcade mentality, so they tend to be harder on the difficulty, and they tend to be limited continues, and a lot of times it's just see how far you can go. It's a test of your skill. A lot of fighting games have opponent AI that can cheat. They can read your button inputs and anticipate what you're about to do. Mortal Kombat is notorious for this. Other fighting games as well have this mechanic. This is where you have to get clever with how you play the game, because you have to cheese the system, which means you have to start an input to trick the game into thinking you're about to do one thing, but very rapidly switch to another move that can counter the move that the game was doing to counter your counter. It's complicated, but it's a thing. But for the most part, you have a life bar, and whoever's life bar gets to depleted first loses. The other person gets the win. Usually, it's a best of 3. So if you win 2 rounds, you won. Usually, but not always. And there's usually, but not always, a timer, a time limit. And it's usually about 90 seconds, give or take. Again, if a timer runs out in those games that has the time limit, whoever has the most health left in their health bar wins. Or whoever landed the most combos or got the most points or did the most damage wins, which is usually the same thing. Different fighting games measure this differently. Then you have what we referred to as fighting games before the one-on-one fighting game I've been talking about came on the scene. These were originally called fighting games, but then they were called brawlers. And then somewhere along the line, they became referred to as beat 'em ups. I first encountered the definition beat 'em up in Jeff Rovine's How to Win at Nintendo Games series of books. I don't know if he coined the term, but I can say definitively he made it popular among young gamers at the time. So that's where it entered the vernacular. Again, I don't know who was the first to use it or who coined it, but I do know at the time magazines referred to fighting games either as Double Dragon type games or Final Fight type games. They just called them fighting games until Street Fighter came on the scene and then Mortal Kombat, and then they had to change their definitions. These are still fighting games. They're played the same. You have a character that has a move set, you have a life bar, you're beating up other characters using the same moves, punch, kick, special moves, etc. These are the same basic game. The difference is your one-on-one fighting game is basically just boss battles. Whereas the brawler or beat 'em up is a 2D or 3D, but usually 2D, fighting game that has the same controls and moves as a traditional fighting game, what we've been talking about. But you have a side-scrolling platformer-esque type level that you can explore, and you beat up an endless barrage of enemies until you get to the end of the level. You hit checkpoints along the way. Sometimes you get power-ups or weapons or items or food replenishes, bonus lives, continues, etc. And then you eventually encounter a boss. Once you get to the boss, it basically becomes Street Fighter at that point, most of these beat-em-ups. Because then it's just you versus the boss one-on-one. Unless the game has multiplayer, and then it's, you and the other players versus the boss. Depends on the game. Most of the time, it's against a single boss, but sometimes you can have two bosses at a time, or your boss can be made up of a small group of ninjas or, whatever. Werewolves or something else. Some examples of this type of game would be Double Dragon, Final Fight, Streets of Rage. Those are your most notable ones. There are plenty of others, but those are the most notable ones. Within the beat-em-up / brawler type fighting game, you have a subset known as the hack and slash. This is where you get into things like Knights of the Round, or Tower of Mystara, whatever the fuck it's called. I always forget. Look, I played the goddamn game, I just can't remember what it's called, alright? Get off my back. Can't remember the name of every fucking thing. I hate it when people give me shit. Well, you should play the game if you can't remember what it's called. I can't remember what everything's called, so fuck off. Okay? Jesus Christ. Golden Axe is another example. Basically, this is a beat-em-up or brawler where you have a sword or some type of swords and sorcery type thing. You have wizards and rangers and elves with bows and arrows and dwarfs with, big hammers or axes. It's essentially a beat 'em up, but with, slasher type weapons, which is why it's called a hack and slash. These sometimes include a little bit more complex gameplay, like the Dungeons and Dragons. I'm just gonna say Tower of Mystara because I can't remember what the fuck it's called. Tower of Doom? I don't remember. Mystara is in the name of one. I don't care. Anyway, I don't give a fuck. Anyways, you can have magic or special powers. You can get items and power-ups. Golden Axe, Knights of the Round, these are all basically the same fucking game. They're interchangeable. And then you have the party multiplayer brawler type fighting game. This one is basically your Super Smash Bros. And Smash Bros. Clones. This type of fighting game, Smash Bros., PlayStation All-Stars, Power Stone, etc., etc., you tend to have multiple characters on screen at a time, usually between 2 to 4. And instead of the goal being to deplete the opponent's life bar, you have different goals depending on the game. It can be to throw them out of the arena. It can be to knock them out of the world, in the case of Smash Brothers. It can be to deplete their life bar, or to just beat them up until they explode into a pile of bones, I guess. I don't know. Different games do different things. These games tend to exist in a pseudo 3D, 2D style. They're usually 3D rendered graphics on a semi 2D plane that might have some pseudo 3D elements, but it's usually 2D. Again, the most popular example is Smash Brothers, which has a shit ton of entries. There's a lot of different Smash Brothers. There's the original, there's Melee, there's Brawl, there's the one on the Wii U and the 3DS, and then there's the one on the Switch. I don't think there's any others, but there might be. I don't know, I could be missing one or two, I don't care. But we don't really refer to these as fighting games in the traditional sense. Some people do. Nintendo nerds do, because, you know, it's the only fighting game on their platform, so they have to call it a fighting game. So people can't say they don't have any fighting games on their platform. You know, but that's just changing the definition of what things are to suit their needs. These aren't really fighting games, but they're in the family, so I'll talk about them, because if I don't, the Smash Brothers nerds are going to shit all over me. And I'm sorry, Smash Brothers nerds, but play a real fucking goddamn fighting game. Go play Virtua Fighter, Tekken, Soul Calibur, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, King of Fighters, and then come back to me and tell me Smash Brothers is a fucking fighting game, because goddamn it ain't. No, it ain't. But if you think it is, it's because you haven't played a real fighting game in your life. If you think Smash Brothers is a fighting game. It's a brawler. It's just a weird brawler. That's what it is. But anyways, I've said my piece. There are other less common types of fighting games I don't really want to talk about too much, because these are getting into the weeds. But this would be stuff like Karate Champ or Best of the Best. And then you also could almost argue that your wrestling games and your boxing games fall under the fighting game camp. You could argue that. I will probably push against you if you try to make that case. But I'm not going to stop you from trying to make that case. I'm just not likely to agree with you. Some wrestling games, maybe. Like WrestleMania, the arcade game. Yeah, that's a fighting game. But WWE, 2K, whatever. No. That's not a fighting game. So it depends on the game, I guess. You know. I don't consider boxing games usually fighting games, with one exception. Ring King I do. Because Ring King is technically a boxing game. It plays more like a fighting game than your standard boxing game. It's got the health bar. It's got your basic moves. Well, punches, basically. And it's in an arena. It resembles a traditional fighting game. More than Punch-Out or, you know, Fight Night or whatever. Those are boxing games. Those aren't really fighting games. But I could make a case for Ring King being classified as a fighting game over a boxing game. Even though it's technically boxing. I mean, I don't remember his name, but there's a boxer in the Street Fighter games. So there's that. By the way, I don't remember most of the names of your fighting game characters, or video game characters in general. I have a hard time with names. I'm just not very good at names. I typically tend to prefer the 2D style fighting game. Now, it can be a 2D plane with 3D graphics. I'm okay with that. But for the most part, I never got into the 3D fighting games. Like I said, for the most part. There's a handful. Maybe 5 or 6 I like. Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, Virtua Fighter 2, Fighting Vipers, Soul Calibur 2 on the GameCube. There might be a couple others. I can't name them all off the top of my head. But usually I prefer the 2D plane fighting game. Again, it can be 2D characters or 3D characters. It can be sprite-based. It can be digitized characters. It can be anime-style characters. I don't give a fuck. Alright, that's all I got to say. Stay cool.